Imagine hitting a major military power way inside their own territory, getting at their really valuable stuff, nuclear-capable bombers, things like that, but doing it for, well, pocket change.
Sounds like science fiction, almost.
Right. But it just happened. And it's making military planners everywhere really sit up and take notice. We're doing a deep dive today into Ukraine's pretty incredible drone attack on Russian air bases. Operation Spiderweb, apparently.
Yeah, and this wasn't just, another strike in the conflict. The sources we've looked at show this was strategic, using technology that's, well, it's widely available. And it highlights some huge vulnerabilities.
Not just for Russia, surprisingly.
No, exactly. Potentially for big established militaries.
Yeah.
Even like the United States.
And that's what we want to unpack today. We've got a whole stack of material, news reports, expert analysis, even some listener notes to really get into what happened, what Russia might do next, and maybe the most surprising part, what this all means for asymmetric threats and maybe vulnerabilities closer to home than you'd think.
We've pulled from Reuters, Sky News, The Economic Times, think tank analyses, commentary. It gives a pretty full picture of something that was incredibly bold, strategically clever, really. And it exposed some real weak spots in how we normally think about defense.
Okay, let's get into Operation Spiderweb itself then. Sources describe it as this big, carefully plotted drone attack, June 1st, 2025. But the detail that really grabs you is how they apparently did it.
Right. You'd probably assume, they flew these drones hundreds, maybe thousands of miles from Ukraine.
Makes sense.
But the sources are pretty compelling that many, maybe even all, of the 117 drones, these small FPV first-person view drones, were actually smuggled into Russia first.
Wait, smuggled? So they launched from inside Russia. How on earth did they manage that?
That's the remarkable part. The technique seems to involve hiding the drones, maybe in commercial trucks, driving them deep into Russia, undetected, getting them close to these major air bases, Diaghilevo, Ivanovo, Alanya, Belaya were mentioned.
And then just launching from nearby.
Launching from close range, yeah. And this wasn't quick. Some sources suggest the planning, getting everything into place, took months. Maybe even up to 18 months.
Wow. So instead of punching through air defenses over long distances, they just sidestepped them. Started inside the fence almost. And the targets you mentioned, high value.
Very high value. Bases with Russia's strategic bombers, the ones that can carry nukes. Plus those really important A-50U airborne warning planes, the AWACS type aircraft.
Okay, so what was the actual damage? I imagine the numbers vary.
They do, as you'd expect. Ukraine initially claimed huge success, up to 41 aircraft hit, maybe 13 or more destroyed. They even claimed it damaged like 34% of Russia's strategic bomber fleet.
Massive. What about other assessments?
U.S. sources mentioned are a bit more conservative. They talk about maybe 20 planes hit, at least 10 destroyed. But the key thing is, satellite photos and videos that came out do seem to confirm hits or destruction. You can see damage on 295s, 222 M3s, and at least one A-50U.
So even if the exact count is fuzzy, serious damage was definitely done to very expensive hardware.
No doubt. And Russia's official line, their Ministry of Defense claimed, they repelled most of it.
Right.
Acknowledged maybe minor damage, some fires. Standard stuff, perhaps. But the visual evidence suggests more.
Right. And the thing that really hammers home the asymmetric nature of this, it's the cost.
Oh, absolutely. Stunning difference. Ukrainian officials put Russia's losses from this single operation at maybe $7 billion. Billions with a B. In damaged or destroyed aircraft.
$7 billion. And Ukraine's cost?
Tens of thousands of dollars. Maybe. For the drones themselves, it's almost hard to believe.
Yeah.
Army Secretary Dan Driscoll actually made this exact point to Congress. He's quoted saying something like, Ukraine inflicted billions in damage. The world saw in near real time how readily available technology can disrupt established power dynamics.
Billions for thousands. That quote,
yeah,
disrupt established power dynamics.
It really hits home. It's not just about having the biggest, most expensive toys anymore.
It's about using cheap, available stuff smartly, disruptively. Which brings us to the next big question. What happens now? What do the sources say about Russia's likely response?
Well, U.S. officials, Western diplomats, they're definitely bracing for something. The consensus seems to be a significant, multi-pronged Russian retaliation.
Multi-pronged and asymmetrical, right? That was the word used.
Exactly. Meaning they probably won't try to copy Ukraine's drone tactics. They'll use their own strengths, different methods. One senior Western diplomat apparently described the expected response as potentially huge, vicious, and unrelenting.
Wow. Vicious and unrelenting. Any idea what the targets might be?
The sources mentioned symbolic stuff, maybe government buildings in Kyiv. But also, specifically, Ukraine's Domestic Security Agency, the SBU, their HQ, regional offices. Michael Kaufman's analysis pointed to SBU facilities as likely targets, maybe using medium-range ballistic missiles, defense factories, too.
Okay. And Russia is blaming the West, partly.
Their foreign ministry did, yeah. Alleged Western support for the drone strikes. And some analysis suggests that if the Kremlin believes the U.S. was directly involved,
And what?
then we might see Russia ramp up the nuclear signaling again, trying to pressure the West, maybe using those dual-capable missiles, the IRBMs. They've apparently done similar things after past attacks they thought had Western backing.
But there's a counterpoint to that, right? About Russia's actual capacity.
Yes, important context from Kaufman again. He makes the point that while a sharp response is likely, Russia's ability to really escalate things beyond what they're already doing, it's actually pretty constrained. They're tied up in the current conflict. So maybe vicious, but perhaps limited in scope.
Interesting nuance. There was also that mention of a call between Putin and Trump.
Right, a brief note on that. Putin apparently told Trump that Russia would have to respond. And Trump publicly advised against it, saying something like, don't do it, you shouldn't do it, stop it.
So a major attack, expectation of a tough, asymmetric response, maybe some nuclear posturing, but potentially capped by reality. But the story doesn't end there.
No, this is where it gets really, eye-opening for places far beyond Ukraine, especially the U.S.
Even if this attack isn't, fundamentally changing warfare overnight, it's highlighting a massive trend.
And that trend, that lesson driven home by this spiderweb operation, is just how effective, cheap, everyday tech can be against incredibly expensive military kit, those FPV drones. Under $700 online, sources say.
$700.
And they can potentially take out a multi-million or even billion-dollar aircraft, like a B-2 bomber sitting exposed. These cheap tools are now deadly weapons.
It changes the whole equation. There's this term in the sources, the air littoral.
Yeah, it's that sort of lower altitude space where these cheap drones operate, below where the big fancy air defenses are usually looking. It challenges the whole idea that controlling the skies with jets means you're safe. The threat's coming from down low now.
And this is the big flashing warning light for the U.S. military, according to these sources. Operation Spiderweb basically put U.S. vulnerabilities on display.
Thomas Shugart from CNAS puts it very bluntly. He's quoted saying, "There is no sanctuary even in the U.S. homeland, particularly given that our bases back home are essentially completely unhardened."
Unhardened, that's the key, meaning planes, expensive gear, just sitting out on the tarmac.
Yeah.
Like the Russian bases that got hit.
Exactly. General Stanley McChrystal, retired Army general, echoes it. We are pretty vulnerable. We've got a lot of high-value assets that are extraordinarily expensive, just sitting there.
And it's not just about, say, China or Russia launching something from afar. The sources are worried about threats inside the U.S.
Right. They mentioned Northcom reported over 350 drone incursions over domestic U.S. military bases last year alone. 350.
That's a lot.
It points to this sleeper threat idea, that these cheap drones could be smuggled in, maybe hidden in commercial cargo trucks driving on highways right past bases, or potentially brought in by individuals crossing borders, then launched from nearby.
Carl Schuster, former Intel director for PACOM, warns about that. Think of all the containers and illegal entrants inside our borders. Every cargo truck could conceal a drone. It's a scary thought.
And U.S. defense leaders seem to know it. They acknowledge the gap. Air Force Chief of Staff General Alvin is quoted, "Right now, I don't think it's where we need to be." Pretty direct.
And Army Secretary Driscoll even more so.
Yeah.
We are not doing enough. The current status quo is not sufficient.
So there's awareness, but an admission that defenses are lagging, which feeds into this whole debate about where the money goes.
Right. Do you spend billions on the next super advanced fighter jet, or do you spend money hardening the bases you already have, protecting the expensive stuff you've already bought?
It's a real tension. General Alvin pointed it out. You can't just play defense, but you also can't ignore these very real low-cost threats. You need counter-drone systems, hardened shelters. It's maybe less glamorous, but potentially more urgent right now.
And sources contrast this with China, which is apparently building hundreds of hardened aircraft shelters near Taiwan. They seem to be taking hardening seriously.
It's a stark difference.
Right.
And maybe the most chilling part, one defense official, anonymously, warned about cheap drone swarms, the potential for a mass casualty event.
Not just military targets, then.
No! Think civilian targets. Sports stadiums, concerts, transport hubs, critical infrastructure, suddenly extremely vulnerable to this kind of low-cost, easily deployable attack.
It really broadens the threat picture dramatically. Just to round things out, there were a few other points in the source material providing context.
Yeah, like Ukraine saying they're ready for a ceasefire, but they think serious U.S. pressure is needed to make Russia negotiate meaningfully.
And some analysis arguing that Western sanctions alone aren't enough for Ukraine, that U.S. military aid is still critical.
And, looking at some commentary, like on Reddit, for instance, there are definitely criticisms floating around about U.S. policy, aid levels, speed of delivery, the overall stance, various viewpoints out there. We're just noting they exist in the sources.
Right. And finally, Slovakia apparently intends to block any EU sanctions on Russia if they think it harms their own national interests.
Yeah.
Just shows the complex international dynamics.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Key takeaways from this deep dive. Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb. A stunningly successful, low-cost attack showing how cheap tech can really disrupt expensive military power.
We're expecting a significant Russian retaliation, probably asymmetrical, targeting symbolic sites, security services, but maybe limited by their overall capacity.
And maybe the biggest ripple. This whole event has thrown a harsh spotlight on major, urgent vulnerabilities for the U.S. military. Unhardened bases, exposed assets, and this growing threat from cheap drones that could even, sources warn, originate from inside the U.S.
Yeah, the material really shows how readily available technology can just upend the old rules, expose weaknesses in ways we didn't really anticipate even a few years ago.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a pretty stark thought, drawn right from these sources. What does national security really mean anymore, when the next big threat might not be a stealth bomber or a missile, but a cheap drone launched from a truck near a highway, maybe not far from where you live,